This is your last chance to drop out and play the game for yourself before watching the rest of this video. First off, words about this game's presentation, including the story and music. Despite all the very valid complaints I'm going to make, there is still a lot to love in this game, and clearly a vast amount of passion, personality and care were put into it. Visuals and music are highlights in particular, and this can be a very beautiful game when conditions are right. How many games can make a painting with every frame of animation? As for the music, there are plenty of memorable tunes, both new and Spooky Condition and Zora is a particular standout for me. I was actually a little disappointed when I finished their main quest and the music went back to normal. In general, I'm a big fan of the understated music that leaves you to wander the open world mostly in silence, just fading in and out occasionally when it wants to make an impression. One of the combat themes in particular I really enjoyed, with the frantic strings imparting a real feel of desperation that made me feel guilty when I was abusing the stun lock while I was playing. When it comes to the story, it's harmless and can mostly be ignored, but it succeeded in making me care about it at exactly one point. Reveal of Zelda's sacrifice in the past that turned her into an immortal dragon. Of course, at the end, they completely cop out and let her turn back into a human anyway, so I knew where they wanted. For the remainder of the story cutscenes, I was at best patiently waiting to regain control, and at worst cringing out of my seat, thankful that nobody else could see me listening to this dialogue and voice acting.
Time power.
The story is both a sequel and a prequel, which is sure to get anyone still obsessing over the Zelda timeline frothing at the mouth. I think most sensible people are well beyond caring about establishing any kind of definitive timeline by now, and I highly doubt Nintendo puts much thought into it either. But there is nevertheless something compelling about seeing the same names, themes and motifs appearing over and over again throughout the pages, as if the actions you carry out in each game are just a single stitch in the unfathomable fabric of time. It's a fitting thematic concept for one of the oldest series in gaming that's already seen multiple creators and personalities fade in and fade out from the development team, and all signs point to it continuing for decades to come in one form or another. But banking on nostalgia and the inertia of brand recognition for sales has led to stagnation before, and it will again if Nintendo isn't able to keep innovating. So let's get into the gameplay itself and see how it works. The overall structure of Tears of the Kingdom looks much the same as its predecessor. When you're done with the tutorial area, you're able to explore in whichever direction you like, with some markers on the map for the main quests, which are better off disabled in my opinion. Just like the previous game, you have the option of seeking out the final boss and seeing the credits roll at any time, including immediately after the tutorial, but no sane person is going to do that on a first playthrough. Assuming you are sane, then the lion's share of that first playthrough will consist of spotting something interesting on the horizon, heading towards it, and then getting distracted by a dozen other points of interest along the way. And when this works, it works really well, especially in the early game. But before getting into that, let's take a quick look at the tutorial and how it prepares the player for the remainder of the game. It gets the player introduced to combat, movement, inventory management, and everything else that's carried over from Breath of the Wild, but the most interesting and memorable parts here are the introductions to the new abilities in this game. First up is Ultra Hand, by far the ability you'll be using the most over a playthrough, both to move things and to stick them together, and you'll quickly start using it to make bridges over gaps or to hook platforms onto rails. You'll also be taught about building powered vehicles using Zonai devices when you have to construct a raft to carry you across a body of water. Remember this one because it will be coming up again, and again and again and again later. Also introduced here is the Fuse ability, which is used to attach items to a weapon, shield or arrow for various different effects, with a number of implications for combat and resource management that I'll get to later. The other two abilities are Recall, which rewrites an object's movements, and Ascend, which launches you through the roof over your head and brings you out on the floor above it. Both of these abilities are quite specific and don't see anywhere near the amount of use that Ultra Hand and Fuse do. And finally, another important takeaway from the tutorial is an understanding of just how interconnected and complex the different systems of this game can get. Temperature, wind, fire, rain, all of these factors can have dynamic effects on both the player and the objects around them, both beneficial and detrimental, and these dynamic effects can be deliberately exploited and played with to accomplish your goals. Dynamic is the key word there, as all of these interactions take place in real time. Here's a comparison to another game that I think gets right to the heart of what I mean by that. Red Dead Redemption 2, you can light a campfire and rest in the wilderness or by the side of the road or wherever you are. To do this, you have to open the game's radial menu, then scroll over and select the right option. And that's it. Arthur will choose an appropriate place nearby and set up a little campfire of his own. From here, you can get access to further menus that you can use to cook food and craft consumables. In Tears of the Kingdom, you, that is to say the player, need to find a pile of wood, place it wherever the campfire is going to go, and then find a way to light it. One of the more obvious ways to do this is by putting a piece of flint next to the wood and striking it, but something like a magic fire rod would do the trick too. And there you go, that's your campfire. If you want to use it to cook food, you can drop it near the fire and watch it transform. Even at a glance, I think it's plain to see the different levels of interactivity at play in these two examples. Red Dead Redemption sees the action abstracted out into a menu, whereas Zelda asks you to assemble the required bits together and then to actually commit the act of lighting the fire yourself using the same attack button you use for countless other interactions. Like so many other things in New Zelda, lighting a campfire is a problem to be solved using whatever means available to you. All of this is possible because of the always-in-play chemistry system that allows items to interact with each other and change state according to certain criteria. Now, if you're familiar with the game, then you may be typing out an irritated comment complaining that I purposely omitted some menu use from this campfire example to make Zelda look better. And you're right, I did do that, and I'll come back to why that was necessary. But for now, just humour me and go along with my assertion that in the ideal Zelda play session, the item menu wouldn't need to be opened even once. The game is by far at its best when every encounter or puzzle independently provides you with the tools needed to get through it, as I hope to show with the rest of this video. To finish up my thoughts on the tutorial, I found my first time going through it to be really enjoyable, although its length can make your second time through a bit tedious. Somewhat ironically, despite the almost unbelievable amount of freedom you have for the majority of the game, linear intro might be the longest in Zelda history, and hours will pass before you get your hands on the paraglider. Still, on first playthrough, I think the tutorial succeeds, and learning and experimenting with the rules of this game is likely to leave you awestruck at the seemingly limitless potential of all of its interconnected systems. Placing a motorized fan on a rail car and riding it along a track makes you feel like a genius. Cutting down trees and joining them together to make a climbable pole on a slippery surface makes you feel like you've outsmarted the developers. Gliding across the sky on a flying wing and changing its direction by shifting your weight on top of it is so liberating that it makes you feel like you've broken the game somehow. This all sounds great, doesn't it? And it is great for the first 10 or 20 hours when everything feels new and you're still learning how everything works. The tutorial and early hours of the game do an amazing job at getting you excited for the boundless possibilities that the rest of the world holds. But the longer you play, the more you will come to realise that it's rarely capable of delivering that promise, and you'll spend the next 100 hours using the same solutions and building the same contraptions until all the joy and wonder have been sucked out of it. But let's not think about that just yet. Let's just explore the world a bit and enjoy seeing the possibilities unfold in front of us. Since you're free to explore in whichever direction you like, every player will see things and make discoveries in a different order. Finding these geoglyphs around the map is how you unlock story tidbits, and descending on them from above to look for the right spot is a clever use of this game's emphasis on verticality. Partially obscured by a forest, you have to make a leap of logic to find what you're looking for. If you're familiar with the previous game, it won't blow your mind to see a dragon soaring majestically through the sky, but it might when you first see one flying through a chasm into the underground depths. Catching a nice looking ball, registering it in a stable, can be rewarding and is pretty much a mandatory inclusion in a Zelda game, but it's only a matter of time until you realise riding horses is kind of useless. As soon as you come across a steep slope or body of water, you'll have to dismount and you'll be back on foot after a quick climb or sprint. While it may not be strictly realistic, there is a logic to how the world is laid out that can be really satisfying to piece together. Almost every NPC will comment on the weather or time of day, and will also clue you in on stuff to look forward to doing later, like the Rito quest. Following a flock of geese can lead you to cave entrances, which is a detail I really love. Hot springs on the surface occur above spots of underground volcanic activity. Being under cloud cover in the desert reduces your temperature. All of these were things that I worked out for myself without the game telling me, and discovering rules and then exploiting them can be one of the most satisfying things about playing a complicated game like this. As for the minute-to-minute exploration, it has to be said that reusing the map from Breath of the Wild has stripped away some of the joy of discovery from the game, which is a real shame, but there's still a fairly high density of things to interact with. My approach to the Skyview Tower north of the Great Forest offers a good example of how your to-do list can quickly spiral out of control while wandering the world. These towers are used to add regions to your map, and can also be used to quickly get into the sky, so finding and unlocking them is usually the first thing you'll want to do in each region. While making my way towards the tower, I spotted multiple shrines and dropped markers on them. When I got to the tower itself, I had to figure out how to open it, and there was an NPC with a side quest available at the bottom as well. When I activated the tower and got launched into the sky, I now had a choice between exploring the nearby sky islands, going back to the shrines I'd marked, looking into that side quest, or heading for the geoglyph I could see nearby. Getting lost in this exploratory loop of seeing something to do and heading towards it, only to get distracted by several more things to do on the way, is one of the primary joys of playing this game. It does start to wear a little thin over time, especially after you've started seeing the same content repeated in different locations, but I want to continue being positive about the game for a bit, so I'll carry on talking about the earlier parts of our playthrough, before the players have a chance to realise how repetitive this game can be. As promised in the intro, there are new areas to discover on top of the map carried over from the previous game. Literally on top of it, in the case of the Sky Islands and archipelagos that can now be found floating above Hyrule. Navigating around them comes with an element of risk that makes it more enjoyable than it would otherwise, although some of this mystique is lost when you start unlocking shrines in the sky that can be teleported to at any time. Still, approached with the right mindset, the Sky Archipelagos can provide some of the most engaging environmental interactions in the whole game, thanks to the more restrictive environment. If you think of them as a chain of islands where each one is a self-contained puzzle with the goal of working out how to get yourself to the next island, then there's a lot of satisfaction to be had in cobbling together an improvised solution from the materials in front of you. The archipelago near the Rito village was the most memorable of these for me. To get from one of the islands to another that was higher up, I had to drop down to a lower level through a hole, then craft a bridge with a spring on top to launch myself back up through the hole and glide over. This was some incredibly satisfying problem solving, using the materials provided by the environment to find a way to accomplish my goals, and it speaks volumes that I remember it so clearly after more than 100 hours of playtime, when so much else has blurred into memory mush in my head. Unfortunately, it's incredibly easy to break these navigational challenges and completely trivialize them, and in fact the game actively encourages you to break them in multiple ways. But, I'm supposed to be being positive right now, so we'll come back to that. Also added to the overworld are the caves I briefly mentioned earlier, which occasionally contain a surprising amount of enemies, treasures, mini-bosses, and other collectibles, and are also the places where you're most likely to use the Ascend ability, if you haven't forgotten that it exists. The features of these caves that I found most interesting are the tunnels choked with rocks that need to be cleared to pass through, once again providing an open-ended problem that needs to be solved using resourcefulness. The solution taught to you in the tutorial is to craft a hammer by using the new fuse ability to attach a rock or something blunt to a weapon, then smashing through the rocks with that. When you're first introduced to it, this feels like an amazing idea, an ingenious improvement over the previous game. Breath of the Wild, where bombs were available in infinite supply, it would have been effortless, and therefore boring, to throw bomb after bomb at any obstacle to blow your way through. Without access to infinite bombs, and with every swing of a weapon draining its durability, Tears of the Kingdom turns these rocks into a resource draining question that needs to be given some thought, at least in the beginning of your playthrough. When you've finished exploring the game, the fact that you can exit using the tunnel you dug yourself is just a beautiful cherry on top. In a similar vein to this rock problem, to look for an axe to cut down a tree, you can make one by fusing a weapon with something sharp. It was a stunning realization when it clicked that the axe I picked up in the tutorial was just a ready-made fused weapon. The fact that you can also attach items that will create gusts of wind, or add elemental attacks to your weapons or shields, or stick items onto arrows to increase their damage or change their properties, means that once again the possibilities feel endless at this early stage. When it comes to arrows, I particularly like that you don't craft them in advance. Fire arrows, bomb arrows, and any other variation you can think of are all crafted on the fly and put in use, and I really think this is a stroke of brilliance. The other new major area added to the game is the Depths, a gigantic underground zone that's like a twisted inversion of the land of Hyrule, languishing in darkness and infested with this gloomy monk. Taken together with the Sky Islands, these two new areas seem almost like Nintendo's deliberate reply to Elden Ring. Oh, what's that? Your game had an extra map screen? Ours has too. Suck on that, Miyazaki. While in the depths, you're subject to the effects of gloom, which means that hearts lost can't be replenished with ordinary food until you return to the surface or to a light route. It's a nice tweak that means it's not quite as easy to pause and heal your way out of danger, which in turn means that combat in the depths feels a bit more dangerous than on the surface, and in the early game when combat is still remotely enjoyable, this can make it a bit more interesting. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. In terms of exploration, the depths introduces an intriguing problem to solve by asking you to find a way to illuminate the environment. They go all the way with it too. There's no ambient light whatsoever, and without the use of some kind of resource or consumable, it really will be too dark to see anything. You can solve this problem by throwing bright bloom seeds, wearing clothing that illuminates, carrying a weapon with a luminous stone fused to it, or cooking and eating a meal that gives you a temporary brightness buff. So there are plenty of options, although personally I found that bright bloom seeds put all the others to shame, and are abundant enough that I was never even close to running out. This becomes irrelevant over time anyway, as you explore the depths further and activate these light roots, which light up the region around them. My own first experience with the depths was very different to the one that I think Nintendo intended. I was exploring the overworld as normal and came across a well, and all the other wells I'd seen up to this point had a little room inside them with maybe a chest or something small like that. So imagine my surprise when I jumped down this well and kept falling and falling, falling, till I was in total darkness and didn't even know how much further down there was to go. I figured out for myself how to use bright bloom seeds to light up my surroundings, and discovered on my own the risks and rewards of engaging with gloom-infested enemies. When I spotted a gigantic room in the distance, my own curiosity led me to it because it looked like something important. I'm so glad I discovered the depths on my own like this without the game leading me here, because unexpectedly ending up in a whole other map with new rules to learn and new dangers to avoid was easily one of the highlights of my playthrough. Compare that experience to the official introduction to the depths that the main quest markers guide you through, where you drop next to an NPC who tells you exactly what to do, and you're only seconds away from a light route that can be used to immediately brighten your surroundings. You spend basically no time at all in the dark if you follow this intended path, and I'm seriously glad that my first encounter with the depths happened on my own terms, rather than as part of this over-tutorialized busy work that the game forces you into. On the one hand, it's a credit to the game that it's even possible to do things out of order as I did, and to discover things on your own without them being shoved down your throat. On the other hand, however, it's a ridiculous waste of the player's time to still force them through that tutorial hours later, even after they've already taught themselves everything they need to know. Whichever way you introduce yourself to the depths, the longer you spend down there, the closer you'll come to realizing that exploring it is more or less pointless, because there's nothing to do. Yes, there are enemy camps, Yiga clan outposts, and mini-bosses to find, but once you've seen one, you've seen them all, and they will all sooner or later become just another thing to avoid when trying to get from A to B. There's precious little to justify the inclusion of the depths, and while it makes a great first impression with its size and scale, this quickly wears off, and it could easily have been reduced by half or even 3/4 with nothing of value being lost. The only other benefit I can see of it being so massive is that it provides a clever way of cluing the player into the location of shrines on the surface. It took me an embarrassing number of hours before it suddenly clicked that light routes in the depths and shrines on the surface are in the same locations, so it's easy enough to compare both maps to pick up on what you may have missed. While the completionist in me did appreciate the helping hand, it has to be said that this stripped away yet another layer of mystery from the depths, and what felt like an intimidating space at the beginning of my playthrough became a repetitive chore well before the halfway mark. And with that, I can no longer avoid getting into the main theme of my criticism for Tears of the Kingdom, and you may have already noticed a pattern emerging in what I've let slip so far. In almost every area of this game's design, what first feels like an intriguing and interesting problem to solve will sooner or later turn into a repetitive grind that you want to get through as quickly as possible by deploying whatever solution worked the fastest last time. In the case of combat, that solution is often to just ignore or avoid enemies entirely, and I'll devote a whole section of the video later to that issue. When it comes to exploration though, the same problem rears its head. Returning to the depths for a minute, part of the navigational challenge down here comes from avoiding the patches of gloom on the ground, since it drains your hearts. In the early stages of a playthrough, you might do this by climbing a tree or wall to get some height and glide over, or by building a bridge or finding another route, or finding a vehicle or skeletal horse to ride over it. You get the idea, there's a lot of ways to solve this problem. Once you've played for long enough that you've reached a certain number of hearts, however, all of these imaginative solutions become total wastes of time compared to the effortless answer of running straight through the gloom and just eating the damage. Maybe you would call this progression, I would call it boring. For another example of how potentially interesting problems can be trivialized, we can look at the way rain stops you from climbing. I actually really like this idea in theory, since it provides a problem that prompts the player to reach their destination using alternative means. In practice, however, it's frustrating and will often lead to you just sitting around waiting for the rain to stop. It's especially maddening when the rain starts halfway through a climb and you have to abandon it. The issue here is that the rain problem is tied to time, meaning that the easiest and least costly solution in terms of resources is to just wait for the rain to stop, which is obviously very boring, but also very sensible. In regions of the map where rain is permanent and it's not possible to wait it out, I think the idea is implemented much more successfully. If climbing is permanently off the table as a solution, then you're forced to find another way. Unlocking the Skyview Tower in this permanently drenched region of the map is also made more interesting by the never-ending rain. The entrance is strangled by thorns, which would ordinarily be effortless to burn through, but with the constant rain putting out fires, you're forced to get creative and find a way around this problem. In my case, by building a shelter over the thorns to keep them dry before burning. Imagine if it was possible to solve this problem by just waiting for the rain to stop, and I think you'll see what a positive difference it can make to place interesting restrictions on the player. Other moments where the player is somehow restricted were among the most memorable and enjoyable in the game for me, like the sandstorm in the Gerudo Desert that forces you to gain height in order to get visibility, or the blizzard in the Rito quest removing the minimap. The fact that Nintendo mostly reserves this kind of thing for the main quests suggests to me that they have some awareness of how much more interesting the game becomes when restrictions like this are in play. As it happens, however, for the vast majority of a playthrough, the game does almost nothing to restrict the player, and I think this is one of the biggest factors that led to my enjoyment of it constantly declining the longer I spent playing. Example 1. At almost any given moment, the player can open the inventory menu and change their clothing for different benefits like temperature resistance, extra damage, faster climbing or swimming speed, or faster skydiving. But the thing is, at any one time, the player is going to be fighting, or swimming, or climbing, or skydiving. Never more than one. For this reason, there are absolutely no interesting decisions to be made around clothing, only an irritating trip to the menu every time you switch to a different activity, which is pretty damn frequent. For all intents and purposes, the effects granted by clothing might as well be permanent upgrades, but they're not. The only clothing sets that buck this trend are the ones that regulate temperature, because you might find yourself in a hot or cold environment while still climbing or fighting, prompting the player to make some kind of trade-off. While this is better than nothing, the excessive menu usage it causes means that it's still not particularly enjoyable, with the Gerudo Desert being the worst region for this by far, as different times of day require different clothing to avoid losing hearts. If the player was restricted from changing clothing at will like this, then every excursion into uncharted territory would necessitate some kind of thoughtful choice about clothing and equipment. Example 2. At almost any given moment, the player can open the inventory menu and spawn a vehicle out of nowhere for a relatively low resource cost, and these vehicles can be used to solve practically any navigational challenge in the game. There are even multiple ways of doing this. You can spawn a vehicle directly from the auto-build menu, or you can drop individual devices from your inventory and join them together manually. Think back to my example from before, with the Sky Archipelago near the Rito village. What I enjoyed about it was that I was able to improvise a solution to the problem of travelling to the next island using only the materials in front of me. In the back of my mind though, on some level I was aware that there was always an alternative solution available to me by opening my inventory and instantly spawning a vehicle or contraption. There's no conscious thought, no engagement with the environment, and crucially, no real problem solving involved in such a solution. The fact that these boring, one-size-fits-all contraptions are freely available to the player for 90% of their playthrough means that the player is very rarely put in a position where they actually have to engage with the world around them. After all, the developers know that I'm capable of flying wherever I like using the same vehicle every time. What reason do they have to think of interesting alternative ways of getting somewhere? Once this toxic info hazard had truly taken root in my mind, there was no longer anything interesting to me about moving around the game's world. There isn't a single navigational challenge that can't be solved by using the same 2 or 3 constructions over and over again. Need to gain height? Just spawn a higher head. Need to cover some distance? Just spawn a wing. A Korok needs to be reunited with his friend? No problem, just stick him on a wing or a car or a raft and scoot on over. Actually, just a wing will suffice in the majority of cases. That is, if it's not one of those cases where you don't even need a vehicle at all and can just walk him to his destination. Seriously, what's the point of this? It's mindless, vapid content. Example 3. At almost any given moment, the player can open the inventory menu and drop or throw pretty much any item they've picked up during their playthrough, whether it was 5 minutes ago or 50 hours ago. Since picking up items is so easy, you'll be grabbing everything that's not nailed down, and your inventory will very quickly balloon. This inventory is practically limitless in size, and it certainly feels that way when you're scrolling through it item by item, searching for something in particular. Once again, I can point to one of my previous examples to reveal how the unlimited inventory works to ruin it. It's true that lighting a fire is done by placing food next to wood and striking it, but what I left out earlier is that you can simply open your inventory and drop some wood wherever you like, then do the same for flint. And yet again, there's absolutely no need whatsoever to engage with your environment or think critically about the options available to you, because you have every option you could ever possibly need freely accessible in your pocket. Thanks to this, building a campfire in Zelda is equally as brainless as it is in Red Dead Redemption, except it actually ends up involving even more menu usage than that game, which I think is an incredibly revealing fact. In all of these examples, the ease of changing clothing, the ease of spawning overpowered vehicles, the ease of summoning any item you've ever touched, the root of the problem lies with the colossal inventory the player has constant access to. The unavoidable conclusion this leads me to is that the game would have been better off with no inventory at all. For one thing, it would cut down on the ludicrous amount of menu use that plagues the game in its current state, but more importantly, it would give the player the chance, or rather the responsibility, to actually pay attention to their surroundings and make use of the problem-solving part of their brain, which surely is supposed to be the whole point of a game like this. It should go without saying that playing without an inventory would be infinitely more engaging and interesting than constantly selecting ready-made solutions from a menu, which, if you catch me on a bad day, I would go as far as to say barely even qualifies as gameplay in any meaningful sense. Playing Tears of the Kingdom is like playing Resident Evil 4 with an infinite rocket launcher. In other words, it's pointless. There are no trade-offs to be made, there's no challenge to be found, and there's nothing interesting about it. Every problem you come across while exploring is solved by opening a menu and selecting the solution from a list, and there's no thought involved whatsoever. When you have an inventory full of hammers, every problem looks like a nail. So yeah, wow, things have really taken a negative turn, haven't they? Some of you might be screaming at your monitor right now, yelling that all this is a problem with me and not the game. So allow me to calmly and rationally tell you why I'm right and you're wrong. Let's look at the Skyview Tower on Mount Lanebru in the east of the map. Sitting right at the peak of the mountain, it's quite intimidating from a distance and looks like it will require some serious effort to reach, presumably with a few problems to solve and diversions to be distracted by on the way. When I actually resolved to go there and activate it, however, all I had to do was use recall on a fallen stone to gain some height and then climb over. It wasn't difficult, it wasn't interesting, and it wasn't particularly fun. Yes, I could have ignored this fallen stone and made my way to the tower the old-fashioned way, but why would I bother doing that when the game freely handed me the tools to do it in a much simpler and faster way? There's a wider conversation to be had here about who holds ultimate responsibility for a player's experience with the game, the player themselves or the developers, and at the risk of being called a centrist, I think the answer lies similarly. Go back and forth on this. My knee-jerk intuition is that the player, as the one holding the controller, has the final say. But there are so many techniques developers can use to influence a player's behaviour in conceivable ways that I'm not sure it's quite so clear-cut. But even if the player does have the final word, I hope most would agree that it's on the developers to, at the very least, encourage the player to engage with their game in the most interesting ways possible. So, when the game drops a stone right in front of me on this mountain, what do you think the developers are trying to say to me? They're saying, here you go, use this. I didn't go out of my way to find this shortcut up the mountain. The game quite literally dropped it in my lap. It may well have been a more interesting experience to climb the mountain myself. The game deliberately nudged me to take the boring path of least resistance. Why would I ignore it? Here's one final example, just to demonstrate that almost everything you enjoy about this game in the first 20 hours will come to piss you off by the end of your playthrough. Earlier I praised the caves with tunnels blocked by rocks because they led to interesting choices about how to clear them, but as with so many other things in this game, you'll eventually realise that there's an obviously dominant strategy. A lot of these rocks are hiding claymores and smaller stones inside, which are just begging to be fused together for a makeshift, and essentially free, rock breakout. Once you realise this, you can go ahead and use the same boring solution almost every time you come across one of these tunnels. While you do always have the option of luring an enemy to break them for you, or using a Zonai cannon, or probably a bunch of other options that never even crossed my mind, there's no reason to experiment with any of this, when you can fall back on such an obvious and simple solution, and I wish the game forced me to improvise and get more creative. Now you might be thinking, okay, but how would you design different improvised solutions that remain interesting over the dozens of caves that are in the game? And my reply to that is, don't make the player do the same thing dozens of times. If Nintendo wants to add another cave but can't think of anything unique to put it in, they should do us all a favour and leave it on the cutting room floor. The caves are yet another feature that could have been cut in half with nothing of real value being lost. I've more than made my point by now about the disappointing exploration in this game, so I won't go on too much longer, but to summarise, Tears of the Kingdom gives the player so much freedom, and gives them ubiquitous access to so many overpowered tools, that any semblance of challenge or intrigue is completely stripped away. Instead of engaging with the world and solving problems dynamically, just select ready-made solutions from a menu, and while this may be interesting the first time, it's boring by the 10th. A major part of the problem here is that the game is too big. It's just way too big, and it really outstays its welcome. I'd say there are around 30 hours or so of worthwhile content, the majority of which is found by following the main quests. The remaining 90 hours of my playthrough were made up of repetitive shrines, Korok puzzles, enemy camps, exploring caves, activating light routes in the depths. Once you've seen a handful of these, you've seen them all, and doing them again and again only makes it more likely that you'll grow tired of solving the same problems with the same solutions. With all of these things being largely optional, again you might say that this is my fault and not the game's. I could have ended my playthrough at any point by heading for the finish line after all. But while I was comfortable leaving side quests unfinished and Koroks undiscovered, I felt compelled to complete every shrine and activate every light route before I was happy going to the ending. As long as there was a slight possibility that I might be missing something unique or interesting, I wasn't ready to call it quits. Sadly, it was extremely rare that I actually did run into something unique or interesting, and by the time the credits rolled, I found myself feeling that my 120 hours with the game had one digit too many. Another word for optional would be skippable, and that's exactly how a lot of the content in Tears of the Kingdom feels. I could easily have skipped 3/4 of this game and had roughly the same experience. A better experience, in fact, because it would have had less filler. My feelings on this are similar to how I felt about Elden Ring. When 90% of the content in a game is optional, does that mean it gets a free pass to reuse ideas over and over again? I'd argue not. The developers of both Nintendo and FromSoft don't seem to agree with me. This kind of repetition has become one of my most hated parts of recent game design. For a counterexample, Shadow of the Colossus is a game that has next to no repetition. It's relatively short and sweet, at least compared to the behemoth length of many modern games, and almost every minute you spend with it is spent doing something new. Imagine if you had to fight the same group of small enemies every time you reached a new area in that game, and I think you'll see how that kind of repetition just detracts from the core of the experience. Okay, it really is time to move on. I know I've been especially complimentary about Tears of the Kingdom so far, fair warning, that's going to continue. But there is good mixed in with the bad, and nowhere is that more evident than in the topic of the next section, shrines and temples. Buckle up! Here's a quick rundown of how shrines work in this game. Dotted all over Hyrule and across the Sky Islands are these big, shiny, shriny rocks, each of which will transport you via a loading screen to a little self-contained area, where the goal is to reach the statue at the end to get a spirit orb, 4 of which can be exchanged elsewhere for an extra heart piece or a bigger stamina. Some shrines contain combat challenges, some contain puzzles, Some contain patronizing tutorials for features you've probably been interacting with for dozens of hours already, and some contain nothing but a platform floating in space with your reward just waiting for you. You still have to sit through 2 loading screens for these ones, but as for discovering and accessing these shrines from the open world, they can most commonly be found sitting on the surface, and are often visible from long distances, making them frequent targets of the manual map marking feature. Since you can immediately teleport back to any shrine that's been activated, these easy-to-reach ones are usually placed near settlements or stables for ease of travel. Other shrines might require you to complete some side quest or puzzle in the overworld to make them appear, like casting a shadow of a certain shape or beating a mini-boss. These more involved shrine discovery tasks are often the ones that lead to empty rooms inside, presumably made up for in Nintendo's mind by whatever you had to do outside to make the shrine appear. Sometimes this is fair enough, sometimes it really isn't. As for the quality of the contents of shrines in general, you should already know that my opinion is largely negative. The vast majority of them are too short, too easy, too repetitive, and just an all-round waste of time. Now even more of them than in the last game too, which is hard to see as a good thing given their dubious gameplay value. Maybe you think I'm being harsh by beginning this section with such a dismissive criticism. By leading with my strongest evidence, I hope I can convince you that yes, the shrines really are that bad. Remember that bit in the game's tutorial where you construct a raft to cross a body of water?
At least it wasn't poison.
There are multiple shrines that shamelessly reuse that scenario almost exactly. I couldn't believe it the first time I saw this. By the 4th time, I got used to the disappointment and repetition and wasn't surprised anymore. Puzzle shrines that don't just rely on recycling ideas from the tutorial almost invariably suffer from a different problem. They're way too simple. They almost never require you to use more than one ability. The average number of puzzles in each shrine is 2, which is just a pitifully small number. The first will usually introduce a puzzle concept, while the second, if there is a second, will offer a slight twist on that concept. Bang, you're done.
Lockchester also new to Etrian Odyssey 3. It kind of felt pointless marking down treasure chests apart from the fact that you get to keep your map if you die. So at the very least you can go look at them again, get them again later.
Here's one that asks you to hit the switch and rewind a ball. That's it, that's the whole shrine. Here's one where you have to align the segments of this tower and then ascend to the top. That's it, that's really the whole shrine. It's truly astonishing to me that Nintendo considered this one acceptable. There are quite literally dozens of examples of time-wasting nothing shrines I can pull from here. To illustrate just how poor the general level of quality is, all I need to say is that I grew so used to each shrine having only 1 or 2 puzzles that it was a genuine shock when I came across one with 3. Although, in order to compliment this shrine, I would have to ignore the fact that it's really the same puzzle repeated multiple times, so this is faint praise. As for the combat-driven shrines, I don't think much explanation is needed on why it feels insulting to discover one of these and be trained on something you've already been doing for 60 hours. Archery training? Seriously, who is this for? If this really is supposed to be a tutorial, why the hell would you put it somewhere the player might not find it for dozens of hours, if they even find it at all? The unskippable dialogue that takes place beforehand is just an additional affront to my patience. And while I'm on the subject, why do I have to skip through 3 separate cutscenes or dialogue boxes every time I complete a shrine? There isn't a single person playing this game who wants to watch this play out more than once, but Nintendo doesn't care. Now, look, it's not all that. There are occasionally shrines that have some interesting ideas that are worth seeing, and I'll show a few examples of them in a moment. But this brings me back to the same complaint I've been making throughout this video. The game's massive size works against it here once again, because that size is what necessitates so much filler. To repeat, you could cut 3/4 of this game out entirely, and it would only improve the experience. Of the 152 shrines in the game, when you know that some are actually worth your time, let's be generous and say 20%, you're still incentivized to try and see them all, on the off chance that the next one you find will be one of the 30 or so good ones. Using our figure of 20%, that means the game has managed to keep you playing 10 hours for every 2 hours of actually worthwhile content. This is shamefully exploitative design that shows absolutely zero respect for the player's time, and I hate it. I fucking hate it. The longer I spend thinking about this game, the worse and worse my opinion of it becomes. But anyway, I was about to say how some of the shrines are actually good, wasn't I? So let's put a pin in me hating the game, just for now. The
Nice.
shrines I would consider worthwhile generally fall into two categories. The first is shrines that introduce genuinely new concepts you haven't seen before, although your mileage can vary on this depending on how much you've already seen in the open world. The shrine that revolves around using the stabilizer device, for example, was really enjoyable for me because I was discovering and teaching myself the rules of a new tool as I went through it. If I had already come across stabilizers in the open world and become familiar with them before finding this shrine, I have no doubt my opinion would have been less positive. Again, this leads me back to one of my major criticisms of the game. Almost every interaction you can have with all of its different moving parts really is enjoyable the first time around. I mean that, it really is enjoyable. The problem is that it makes you do these interactions again and again until you're sick of them, and after the first 20 hours or so of a playthrough, new things to discover are spread very thinly indeed. Honourable mentions for other shrines with interesting ideas include ones where you have to build a contraption that will keep its balance while sliding along rails, ones where you have to join together mechanical gears, the one that tricks you into thinking it's an empty shrine and then pulls the rug. I wish there were more that did this, and also the Jacob. Enough said. I'll temper my praise for these by saying that most of them feel like introductions to concepts with room for a lot more complexity, but as usual, that potential for complexity is never explored in this game. The second category of shrine that I think is worth your time is made up of the ones that take away equipment and ask you to improvise a way of taking out a room full of enemies. Given what I said in the previous section about the value of placing restrictions on the player, this will probably come as no surprise. That's not to say these shrines are perfect. They still have damage sponge enemies, and vehicles are still impossible to control accurately. But while there may have been areas in the open world that better delivered on the promise of spontaneous problem solving using the tools and systems in front of you, these shrines are the only parts of the game that I can recall that actually force you into this improvisational mode, and I think they deserve some kudos for that. They usually have traps that can be triggered in various ways to damage enemies, and I enjoyed figuring out how to exploit these for maximum effect, even if I had to fall back on giving enemies a good old smack to finish them off. Having some unique enemies or even a mini-boss in one of these shrines could have made for some interesting twists, because there's definitely a lot further to go with this idea, but on the whole, I'm just glad the concept was explored at all. For being similar to this category of shrine, another honourable mention goes to some of the shrine tasks of the sky, which ask you to transport a crystal from one island to another. If you're able to ignore the fact that you can spawn a flying platform at any time to instantly solve this problem, then it can be enjoyable cobbling together a way of moving the crystal to where it needs to go, using locally sourced materials. So that's about it for shrines, but there's another dungeon-like feature in the game that I might as well cover in this section: the temples. At the end of each map region's main quest, you'll get to an elemental temple, the companion of one of the nearby fantasy races. The goal of activating a certain number of switches to unlock access to the boss, then be defeated to end whatever environmental calamity it was bringing down on the region. In practice, these temples are sort of like extra-large shrines,
Holy
which is why
shit.
I'm justified in including them again. But to their credit, they do have factors that make them a bit more unique. The Fire Temple, for instance, will see you building ramps to launch your Goron companion into gongs to activate the boss switches, and the fact that you have control over where and when to launch him makes this problem a bit more freeform than similar ramp building puzzles encountered in shrines, where balls will just spawn and roll along by themselves. The freedom of movement you have in temples, and the ability to activate switches in whatever order you like, makes temples into more of a navigational challenge than shrines are, and helps that for the most part they are pretty damn big. In multiple different temples, you'll find yourself looking through some bars of a switch and trying to piece together in your head what the alternative route inside might be, which can be a satisfying exercise. The construct factory that serves as the lead up to the Spirit Temple in the depths was one of my highlights in terms of using vehicles to solve puzzles. And once again, the reason for this is the restrictions placed on you, which require you to apply some actual thought to the problem. You can't rely on the same old auto builds as everywhere else, because the goal down here is not to transport yourself around, it's to transport these big blocks around, and you'll be attaching wheels and other powered devices to them in several different configurations to make it through the gauntlet. There isn't a whole lot more to say about the temples, and nothing in them is likely to blow your mind, but the fact that they are, on the whole, so much more enjoyable than the ostensibly similar shrines reveals yet another flaw at the heart of this game's design. Shrines being optional, and Nintendo having no guarantee that every player is going to see any given shrine, it makes sense that they would devote less resources to making each one interesting or unique. But with every player being encouraged to complete the temples for story progression, it's only natural that they've received a lot more work. And yes, it's true that temples and shrines are both technically optional for reaching the ending, but any rational player would agree that shrines are more optional. I think you know what I mean when I say that. Missing out on a quarter or even half of the shrines would be no great loss. Missing out on one of the temples would mean skipping a major portion of the game's unique content. I can see this leading to a kind of chicken and egg situation. If the contents of shrines were more worthwhile, I might not be so dismissive of them as wastes of time, but if Nintendo had devoted more energy to making shrines good, then they probably would have given them more prominence and made them less optional to begin with. Maybe a middle ground solution here could have been consolidating several shrines worth of puzzles into one, and actually have the room to expand on a puzzle concept, rather than ending after 2 minutes, with the choice of a health or stamina upgrade at the end. If these combo shrines come too close to stepping on the toes of the temples, then just call them temples and add twice as many temples in the game, or make the existing temples twice as big. I don't see an issue with that, and in fact I would prefer it to the fragmented crumbs of puzzle solving dished out by the shrines of the young now. I'm hoping Nintendo sees the light and moves on from this open world formula for the next entry in the series, but if they do make another game with these pitiful tiny shrines, they'll be revealing themselves as hacks of the highest order. A couple of scattered thoughts about shrines before I move on. For a long while, the puzzles that took me the longest time to solve were the ones that required the use of Ascend, not because they were difficult, but because for the first half of my playthrough, I kept forgetting that Ascend existed. I'm guessing this was an issue for some playtesters too, because shrines that require the use of Ascend will sometimes remind you of its existence by forcing you to use it at the beginning. I think the source of this problem is the very specialized use case of the ability, which means it's not exactly a flexible tool for puzzle solving, unlike Ultra Hand or Fuse, which you'll almost constantly be using because they can do so many different things. Ascend, on the other hand, is mostly used in the open world for quickly exiting caves, or very occasionally for gaining height when scaling something. But in these cases, you almost always have alternative and more intuitive options, so it's easy to forget about it entirely, and then carry that forgetfulness over into shrines. Finally, the length and complexity of side quests or tasks that end with a shrine can vary wildly. Sometimes you ski down a slope and you get a shrine.
Lame.
But in the strangest example I came across, one side quest involves discovering 3 separate Iga hideouts placed all over the map to collect the Iga uniform, then completing another task all over Gerudo Canyon for the Blade Master, making offerings to these little statues. And at the end of all that, you get a shrine, the same reward you've already found dozens of times over, just sitting there in the open world. It's bizarre. Okay, that really isn't the shrines now. Next on the chopping block, combat. When it comes to combat, I can more or less stick to the theme of all my other criticisms of the game so far. That is, almost every interaction you can have with the combat system presents an enjoyable and interesting problem to solve the first time you encounter it. Experimenting to figure out the weakness of an enemy on the fly, and then exploiting that weakness to take them down, can be incredibly satisfying the first time around, like solving an open-ended puzzle with one of the most diverse toolsets in all of gaming. The second time, armed with knowledge from your previous encounter, less interesting. The third, even less, and by the fourth, it's no longer worth your time to engage with it. Just imagine a puzzle game that made you solve the same puzzle over and over again. It's immediately obvious how boring that would be to play, but that's exactly how it feels to fight the same enemy groups, mini-bosses, and even actual bosses repeatedly in Tears of the Kingdom. So, yet again, I'm coming straight out the gate firing negativity on all cylinders, but there is a hell of a lot of potential in the combat system here, and flashes of brilliance that show that Nintendo is more than capable of drawing out that potential. To my mind, the fact that I ended the game so bored of the combat is simply more evidence that the game is way too big, and that repetitive filler content never adds to a game's value, it only subtracts from it. So let's get into how exactly the combat works. If you've played Breath of the Wild, then a very large proportion of it will already be familiar to you, from weapon movesets to enemy types and mini-bosses, to the divisive weapon durability system, but an attempt has been made to add new stuff too, most notably in enemy variety and in the additional properties that certain weapons can carry. Let's start with the options on the player's side. There are 3 weapon types: one-handers for quick strikes, two-handers for slow and broad attacks, and spears for long-range pokes. So inclined, you can include bows as a 4th weapon type, but they belong in a different category in my opinion. Weapons can have different properties like doing more damage near water, or increasing the damage of sneak attacks, and their damage values can also be augmented by fusing monster horns or other materials to them. More on that shortly. On top of that, weapons can either be blunt or sharp, which makes them more or less suited to different tasks like breaking rocks and armor or cutting through trees and vines. You have a certain number of weapon slots, shield slots, and bow slots for carrying these different weapon options around, with the chance to expand these slots coming as a reward for completing mindless 5-second puzzles, collect Korok seeds. By the time you reach the end of a playthrough, you're likely to have an absurd number of weapons that take a truly ludicrous amount of time to scroll through when trying to switch between them, which the game encourages you to do often by making different ones more effective in different scenarios. Just like changing clothing, this is another feature that adds a monumental amount of menu usage to the game, and I think it could have benefited greatly here from restricting the player a bit. If you ask me, and by watching this video you are asking me, the less menu use the better, and my own, potentially extreme opinion is that limiting the player to exactly 1 weapon, 1 bow, and 1 shield carried at a time, with no inventory whatsoever, would make for far more compelling gameplay, as you would have to constantly be weighing up damage values, durability, and additional properties to make trade-offs every time you swapped your weapon for a new one. I know the durability mechanic was a controversial inclusion in the last game, but I actually really like it in theory, because it turns every weapon swing into a choice with tangible consequences. Without those consequences, combat would become even more dull than it is now, and actions like breaking rocks in caves would cease to involve any interesting decisions. Sadly, once you reach a certain point, the desire to avoid those draining consequences will play a big role in encouraging you to avoid combat altogether, but I'll get to that in a bit. Anyway, while you do have access to a small army's worth of killing implements at any given time, there's a more interesting tool that can be used against groups of enemies: the environment itself. If you're in a patch of dry grass, you can start a fire to burn several at once, and even destroy any wooden weapons, then catch the updraft to rain arrows on them from above. If you're near a river or lake, you just need to knock an enemy into it to send them to an instant watery grave. Being near water will also make electric arrows more effective, which can cause enemies to drop their weapons while being shocked. A lot of enemy camps will have explosive barrels littered about, and the urge to throw, shoot, or otherwise combust them is impossible to ignore at the beginning of the playthrough. Stealth is also an option, as is gliding down to an enemy camp from above, picking off the sentries, and getting the drop on snoozing baddies before they know what hit them. As you've no doubt guessed by now, I found these environmental interactions to be where the combat could be at its most interesting, thanks to the improvised strategies they encourage. However, I have to take the wind out of that phrase by saying that, as usual, just because these strategies are possible doesn't mean they're optimal, and by the time you've worked out that the most reliable way to take down a damaged spongy enemy is to stunlock them with a big sword and grind their health down, you're not likely to wheel out these kind of interesting tactics very often. Again, if you weren't allowed and encouraged to keep an inventory full of powerful weapons capable of doing this at all times, there might be a reason to come up with a more creative way to dispatch these enemies. As it is now, there isn't. Moving on to defensive options, these include raising a shield, sprinting out of the way, or jump dodging, which can lead to a flurry rush counterattack if the gods of RNG deem you worthy of their favour. I've played this game for over 120 hours, and I still have no idea how Flurry Rush works, and can't trigger it consistently. If you've played this game, or the previous one for any length of time, then you should know exactly what I'm talking about. No matter how perfectly you appear to have dodged an attack, it just doesn't happen when you expect it to. It's so inconsistent that I'd honestly be surprised if even the developers were able to execute it 3 times in a row. It's impossible for me to say whether this is intentionally inconsistent or a glitch, or yes, a skill issue, so I won't linger on it too long, but suffice to say that it doesn't
It's a skill issue.
mechanic that is so seemingly random. Even if it did work consistently, I have to say that it's not an especially interesting mechanic, because once activated,
agree.
there's only a single possible response, hammering the attack button. It's not exactly deep gameplay. Ganondorf squeezes out his own McFlurry to use against you in the final battle, and it would have made for a really surprising and satisfying turn-the-tables moment if you could reliably do the same back to him. But of course you can't, and it just feels clunky and awkward as a result. As it happens, it won't set you back too much if you mess up a dodge, and in fact, avoiding attacks isn't that important to begin with, because you can easily pause the game at any time and heal your way out of any trouble instantly. Hearts in the corner of the screen is practically irrelevant, because you actually have hundreds of hearts at your fingertips, immediately accessible only a menu away. You'll be pausing to heal like this especially often during the early game, when 1 or 2 hits are still enough to kill you. You can't die from a single hit if you're at full health, so an enemy attack that would have killed you just leaves you with a quarter of a heart. Basically have no choice but to pause and heal back up to full. Just stop and think for a second what that really means. Every single time you make a mistake and take damage, you have to pause the game, navigate through a bloated menu of potentially more than 100 items, and decide what you're going to eat to get that health back. It's mind-boggling to me that Nintendo was happy enough with this system to use it for 2 games.
That was easy.
Just quickly while I'm on the subject, there's a classic weapon that does extra damage if you use it when you're at 1 heart or less, so there's a mechanical incentive to stay at low health and make use of that bonus if you have a weapon that carries it. But because Link flashes red, this annoying pinging noise plays when your health is low, the option isn't worth thinking about, and you might as well just heal up.
It's technically a lot better than how it was in old Zelda games where it's always
so I immediately turned them off the second I was able to, and never made use of the options they provided. These avatars are a step backwards from the companion abilities in the previous game if you ask me. In the depths, you can experiment with using vehicles in combat, and as you can imagine, there are a lot of options in play here. You can attach lasers, cannons, flamethrowers, spikes and more to any vehicle, which seems at first like an amazing array of choices. But the thing is, you never really have enough control over vehicles to reliably use them in combat. Cannons will fire at set intervals with no way to influence their fire rate or aim outside of moving the entire vehicle. You can attach a steering stick to vehicles that is pretty much mandatory if you want to have any control over them at all, but it doesn't come with a fire button for attached weapons, and I really don't understand this because it seems so obvious. With control out of your hands and the odds stacked so thoroughly against you, it does at least feel good to pull off a successful attack with the vehicle, but the mechanics are so unwieldy and the alternative so much quicker and easier that it's just not worth the time or effort, even at these Yiga outposts which seem to be crying out for you to engage in vehicular combat. It comes back to the same problem as always. I could go to all the effort of constructing a raft and outmaneuvering the Yiga captain, or I could just jump up and headshot him in 2 seconds. Guess which method I defaulted to over time. Why bother spending my time designing a monster-killing brute Goldberg machine when I can just shoot them with an arrow or stunlock them with a big sword? You might be tempted once more to say that this is a problem with me, not with the game. Surely it's on me if I consciously choose to go with a boring safe option over a more interesting one. Well, perhaps needless to say, I don't think so. Part of the role of a game's designer is to encourage players to interact with it in the most interesting ways possible. Sometimes that means putting in obstacles to prevent the most boring and safe solutions from being viable. If the Yiga captains were protected from easy headshots by a force field, or something that required the use of a zonal device to break through, then I would have a reason to get creative with a vehicle or some other contraption. In other words, I would have an actual problem to solve. But they're not, and I don't, so an easy headshot will do the trick just fine. Given that this simple solution also uses far less resources than an elaborate contraption, why wouldn't I just do that every time? Even if vehicles were more viable and easier to control, you're still severely limited on what you can achieve with them by your battery capacity, another resource you'll be slowly expanding throughout the playthrough. On top of that, vehicles will actually despawn after a certain amount of use, meaning they're rarely worth investing any time in. Yes, I know I've been advocating for more restrictions on the plane throughout this video, and I do think that some restrictions on vehicles is sensible. The whole battery thing seems a bit too punishing to me, and it strongly discourages experimentation, particularly early on. It's also especially annoying that enemies' vehicles are under no such restrictions. Perhaps a better way to offer progression in vehicle building across a playthrough would be by limiting how many zoning devices can be attached to a single contraption. The possibility of increasing that number with upgrades, just like how the battery can be upgraded now. Even if it didn't make vehicles more useful, it would at least make experimenting with them less painful, and the creative people who enjoy pushing the building system to its limits would probably be grateful for the change. Okay, so that about covers the player's options in combat. I'll move on to the enemy side now. Starting with the standard enemy counts dotted around the overworld and the depths. These are usually populated by a mix of little bokoblins, bigger moblins, sneering Lizalfos, and new to the sequel, flying Aerokudas. In combination, they can offer some surprising interactions, like a moblin without a weapon hurling one of his smaller colleagues at you, or an Aerokuda grabbing an archer and flying them around as a moving sentry. They may not provide much of a challenge when fought in isolation, but these minor enemies are nevertheless capable of a surprisingly complex range of behaviors. They sleep at night, they ride horses and carts, they look for food to eat, they grab new weapons when theirs are lost, and they can even strafe when running towards you to avoid getting an arrow to the face. The boss bokoblin is a new enemy with a lot of personality, and I do like the way they lounge around when not on combat. The horror-grids and lifelike ceiling caves, the robotic constructs lingering on the sky islands, and the Gibdo monsters infesting the desert all appear to add some much-needed variety. But however impressive the diversity of enemies and their dynamic behaviors may be, none of this changes the fact that they can all be taken down with the same strategy. As soon as you've got them stunned once, which is usually as easy as getting a single headshot with a bow, putting them in a stun lock cycle means it's already over. The omnipotence of this tactic means that the only question you really need to answer when taking on regular enemies is which weapon's durability you want to train to do so. This question is nowhere near interesting enough to sustain a playthrough of over 100 hours. I don't want to come across as ungrateful here. Tears of the Kingdom adds quite a lot of new enemy types, actually more than I was expecting to see, but making me find dozens, if not hundreds of them over a playthrough led to me getting completely burnt out on them, and in the end it still had me crying out for something new that never came. I repeat that if the game in this world was smaller, then there would have been less repetition and this would have been far less likely to happen. The only standard enemy type that consistently got a reaction out of me during my playthrough was the gloomy re-dead hand things that chase you relentlessly and continually respawn. Running away from them consistently felt tense, like I'd avoided real danger, but I think the biggest reason for that may just be because they're the enemy type I encountered the least, so I didn't get a chance to become bored of them. If that is the case, then it says a lot about how the massive size and repetitiveness of this game works against it in the end. The other group of enemies are the bosses and mini-bosses, which are automatically more interesting to fight than the standard groups, both because they're more rare and because they can't be stun-locked, meaning they require more attention and strategizing to defeat. Lynels present a very traditional kind of call and response boss fight, where they cycle through a series of moves and you need to deploy the appropriate response to each one until you win. There's nothing wrong with this, of course, but it does mean that by the time you defeat your first one, you've already formulated a reply to each of its moves. When you come across a second Lynel later, what additional value are you really going to get from fighting the same boss again? I felt the same way about the Froxes found in the depths, which are disappointingly the only enemy type unique to that area. Discovering and beating my first one was a fresh challenge that I enjoyed, coming across it in the mid-game when fresh challenges were rare, but beating my second one revealed that it was the exact same challenge again. I ignored the third one I saw. The first time I saw a stone talus burst out of the ground bristling with bokoblins, it was a genuine surprise to me, and it had my jaw on the floor. But of course, I was never surprised by it again, and eventually was more likely to be annoyed by the sight of one in my path than excited. My time with the Flux Construct mini-bosses offers the starkest example of how too much repetition can start to subtract from your experience playing. My first fight against one of these was a long and painful ordeal as I slowly whittled down its health with the occasional lucky shot on its moving weak spot. On my second or third encounter, something clicked and I realised that I could use Ultra Hand to literally tear the boss to pieces, an incredible revelation that allowed me to turn the tables and make short work of a boss that had previously given me a bit of trouble. Even though this technique made the boss fight quite easy, I didn't care because it was something I figured out for myself without being told by the game. It felt hard-earned. After repeating this tactic over many successive fights against the same boss, however, it turned from a fun discovery to a boring slog, and I have a hard time believing that Nintendo thinks anyone will find this interesting enough to want to do it 20 times over a playthrough. On a long enough timescale, everything fun in this game eventually morphs into filler. My favourite mini-bosses in concept are the Hinoxes, because it feels like they're actually reacting to what you do during a fight, rather than being totally one-sided, as in the Limelight characters. You'll realise quickly that Hinoxes have a glaring weakness in the middle of their face, and if you ping them in the eye hole, they'll go down and allow some free hits. Sounds a bit too easily exploitable, doesn't it? And it would be, if not for the fact that they'll cover their eyes with their hands to prevent this from happening the second time. I can't overstate what a mind-blowing thing this is the first time you see it, because it just makes so much sense, and yet I can't recall seeing any good examples of it in other games. Wouldn't you want to cover your weak spot in just the same way if you knew your enemy was trying to exploit it? Unfortunately, the first time you saw this was actually 6 years ago in the previous game, so it doesn't have quite the same impact today. Bosses performing logical responses to prevent dominant strategies like this is such an amazingly compelling idea, yet disappointingly it doesn't appear anywhere else in the game, except arguably in the final boss, and I really can't understand why that is. Surely Nintendo should have been able to come up with some new avenues for this idea in the 6 years between games. Another excellent feature of Hinox fights is the fact that you can grab weapons from their necklace mid-battle. It means that the encounter itself is providing you with the materials you need to beat it, and by now it should go without saying that I believe this game is at its best when that is the case. It's largely unnecessary, because you almost certainly have an entire armory in your pocket already, but I appreciate the idea and see it as further evidence for my theory that having no inventory could improve the game, as grabbing these weapons mid-combat would have been actually useful. Finally, behaviours like picking up trees to use as clubs, or the Stalnox variant doing their best Marilyn Manson impression, are really nice touches that can make these fights feel even more dynamic. Sadly, most of my encounters with Hinoxes didn't showcase even half of this potential complexity. Because you always come across them sleeping, you can usually get in enough early hits to burst down a massive chunk of their health and make the whole thing into a cakewalk that's over all too soon. Rounding out the bosses are the ones encountered during the main quest, at the end of each temple, and I think it's fair to say they're focused on spectacle over challenge or depth. There's nothing at all wrong with a boss fight being easy if it's done well and succeeds at creating the spectacle it's trying to. Not every game has to demand a high level of mastery to beat him. But when a boss is so easy that it feels anticlimactic, and you don't even get to experience it properly before it's over, I think most would agree that's a problem. The Colgera boss that serves as the climax of the Wind Temple presents just such a problem. The music that plays during this boss fight is a heart-swelling rendition of the Rito theme that hits like a nostalgia trunk full of Tamagotchis and Beanie Babies, but I beat the boss so quickly that I didn't get to hear the bit that goes like this. Which is arguably among the most important elements of this spectacle, and it's of infinitely more interest to me than this lukewarm boss fight. Adding insult to injury is